Okay, welcome back to this continuing series of lectures in macroeconomics. I'm Tony. The lecture, our fifth session, we're going to look into the banking system and how banks collectively create money. Now, as you recall, in the last lecture, we built a basic balance sheet for a company and extended that to look at the balance sheet of a bank. So just to remind you, here on the right hand side we have liabilities. This is the money side, or what we call capital. It's what we owe people. On the asset side, this is the stuff we've acquired with those funds, so we own these assets. This is stuff. So we amass capital or money to acquire stuff so we could operate our business. So here on the right hand side we can see that the owners have contributed $10,000 in equity, and the bank has borrowed from the Federal Reserve Bank $10,000, so that's a debt they owe, and depositors have put $80,000 into the bank, so that's also a debt that we owe back to our depositors. So we have debt and equity here of $100,000. So that's all the capital we have, or all the money that we have to operate this bank. And we're going to use that to acquire assets. So we have to set something aside in reserves. It's mandated by law. Here we've set aside $5,000 just for the sake of discussion. And we have $5,000 in cash also set aside so we could operate. We have loans of $65,000 and investments of $25,000. So everything adds up nice and neatly, but we have $100,000 in assets. Our loans and our investments will earn a return, because we're going to charge interest or earn a return on our investments, mostly in securities or debt instruments. And so we have earning assets here of $90,000 out of $100,000. So let's see what happens when a depositor enters into this, making a deposit in the bank. So essentially I like to look at this as a shock. And we had a beginning position, and now a customer deposits $10,000 in a checking account. Well, this is more funds, more capital for the bank, but since people may withdraw this, it's liability against which we must hold some reserves. So let's suppose that the Federal Reserve Bank sets a requirement of 10% of these deposits to be held aside. So we set $1,000 aside for these funds, and we put it into our checking account at the Fed. The remaining $9,000 is excess. So of the $10,000 in deposits, $1,000 is set aside as required reserves, and the remaining part, before it's used, is excess reserves. It's got it reserved. It's not being used anywhere. So here I just have it in the cash account for $9,000. So of the $10,000, $1,000 is required and $9,000 is excess. Well, the bank doesn't want to just hang on to this because it has bills to pay and it's got to pay depositors and wants to make some money on it. So in this case, we're going to assume that the firm makes a loan of $9,000 using those excess reserves and using them up completely. So here we have a shock into the system, reserves being set aside or leaking out of this flow, and the remaining $9,000 of excess reserves being used as a loan. So on the right hand side, liabilities have increased $10,000. That is, we have $10,000 more in capital, and that means we could have $10,000 more in stuff, and the $10,000 more in stuff we have is $1,000 in our checking account and $9,000 in loans. So hopefully this is fairly straightforward. Now that we've seen the balance sheet of the bank and a deposit of $10,000, let's just look at this again with changes only. So there's a shock to the system and customers deposit $10,000 in their accounts. This is a new liability, so the bank must, according to law, regulations of the Federal Reserve, hold some aside in reserves. In this case, we're going to assume that it's 10%. It's easy to calculate. So $1,000 set aside in reserves. That's in your checking account at the Fed. That leaves $9,000 in cash. It's in excess of what's required. And in this particular case, we're going to use the entire $9,000 in excess reserves to make a loan. So here's the impact on this single bank one. Now we'd like to trace this through in the next slides to see where the $9,000 may eventually go. So now let's look at 3 banks and follow the potential or hypothetical impact of the $10,000 in new deposits through the banking system. And of course this is simplified and hypothetical in order to be able to see what the process could potentially look like. So $10,000 is deposited in Bank 1. It's required by law to set aside some reserves here that we've suggested as 10%. So $1,000 is set aside in reserves. It's held at the Federal Reserve Bank. $9,000 is in cash or excess reserves, and this bank is going to make a loan of $9,000. Well, this loan is obviously to some other entity. Let's assume that a company borrows this $9,000 and it's going to use it. Well, it's not going to keep it in its pocket. I can make it $9 million, so you're not wheeling that around in a wheelbarrow. And let's assume that they make a deposit, whoever borrowed the money, into their bank, which is Bank 2. Well, now Bank 2 has an increase in deposits of $9,000, but again, according to federal regulatory policy, the Federal Reserve says, well, set some aside in reserves and the rest is excess, and you can do what you wish with those within the regulatory constraints. So Bank 2 sets aside 10% or $900 and makes a loan of $8,100. Now this entity that received the loan also is not going to carry it around in their pockets. They deposit it in a bank, Bank 3. That bank sets aside some required reserves and can make a loan with the resulting excess reserves. So what you see here is the expansion of demand deposits among banks. So the initial $10,000 flows through to Bank 2 and Bank 3. Right? Well, there are no leakages. It's all totally used. It's not spent right away. But this is for the sake of exposing the process. And the $10,000 that entered into Bank 1 created a loan of $9,000, which entered Bank 2. It's shrinking in size because we have to set some aside in reserves, but now that creates a loan of $8,100. This flows into Bank 3. Again, it shrinks a little because we're setting some aside in reserves. We're saving it, and there's a loan of $7,290. So what we see here is a cycle of lending and spending. Bank 1 made a loan. That company is going to put it somewhere and probably spend it. Bank 2 did the same. And so we have this creation of lending and spending through the connections in the banking system, or what we would call the expansion of demand deposits. Already you can see that demand deposits have increased from 10,000 plus 9,000 plus 8,100. So there's more borrowing, which means there's more debt in the economy, and also more spendable money in the form of checking accounts. So checking accounts are growing, and lending and debt of companies is growing. Okay, now that we've seen this movement through 3 banks, Bank 1, 2, and 3, let's look at this process once more, and you can get a little more familiar with the numbers, but this time I'm increasing the reserve requirement from 10 to 20%. So here with a $10,000 liability, 20% is set aside instead of 10%, which means excess reserves are $8,000, and be a little less than in the previous case, and this $8,000 could become a loan. The loan in turn ends up in someone's hands, person or company, and is deposited into a checking account against which Bank 2 must hold 20% or $1,600 and can use the remaining for lending. Moving to Bank 3, we have repeated the process, a deposit of $6,400, reserve set aside of 20%, and the remainder going in to lending. And so now we have the expansion of bank deposits, 10,000, 8,000, 6,400. But if you remember the previous slide where we only had to set aside 10% in reserves, we had more available for lending, so total creation of demand deposits and lending was higher when the reserve requirement was only 10%. But now we see what we call the multiple expansion of bank deposits moving through the system, and it's based on the fact that banks must only keep a fraction of the deposits in reserve, or what we call a fractional reserve system. So let's try this one more time. I think you get the idea. It should be fairly straightforward. Someone deposits $50,000 in Bank 1 into their checking account. That raises the total amount of liability and equity or capital of Bank 1 by $50,000. That is, they could use that to acquire stuff. Well, stuff on the left-hand side. The reserve requirement in this particular case is 10%, so we set aside 10% or $5,000. The remaining $45,000 in cash is excess reserves, and we can put this to use. Of course, we have a lot of choices for it. It could go to investments as well as loans, but we're going to put it all in loans for the sake of simplicity. And our excess reserves were used to make $45,000 in loans. So the liabilities of the bank went up, which means their assets go up. And now this loan of $45,000 creates a demand deposit somewhere else, which creates reserves of 10% and more lending. So again, we have lending and spending, because although we're not showing the spending piece of drawing down on the demand deposits, this checking accounts are fairly liquid, and so those would be drawn down. Bank 3 receives $40,500, and the deposit holds 10% aside and lends the remaining $36,450. Again, we see this multiple expansion of bank deposits within the system. No single bank can do this, but we can trace through how an initial impact is multiplied through the system. So if you think of it kind of as an upside down pyramid, we have something entering and then a house of credit and lending built on that kind of base set of deposits. And this is a situation of the banking system creating money because we can spend the checking deposits that we've created, our checking accounts. Now, 3 rounds have increased our deposits, but of course each round gets smaller and smaller because each bank is setting aside some in reserves. But what's the ultimate expansion in this process, hypothetically and potentially? Well, with a reserve requirement of 20, we set aside 2,000, lend, have 8,000 in excess reserves, and we use that to make 8,000 in a loan. All right. So typically now we understand this, but this 8,000 is going to move through the system. We know it's going to go to Bank 2 and Bank 3. With a 10% reserve requirement, the expansion ends up, as we've seen already, 10,000 deposits in Bank 1, 8,000, and then 6,400 in Bank 3. So already this series of deposits is growing, but getting smaller each time because each time a bank has to set aside required reserves. But again, if we remind ourselves that it's a loan and then a deposit, a loan and a deposit, these demand deposits can be spent. So essentially we're creating money. And there's going to be some continued diminution, shrinking of this lending because reserves at each bank, and the process will eventually run out. But the ultimate conclusion of that series is that the initial amount of excess reserves, what we had to lend out to begin with, will be multiplied by some amount. And for us, derive the equation, but 1 over what leaks out would be equal to our multiplier. So here you can see I have 1 over what leaks out. That is 1 over the reserve requirement, or 1 over 20%, 0.2, gives me a ratio of 5. So any shock in the system, any increase in excess reserves, can hypothetically increase 5-fold as it moves through the system. All right, so it's the multiplier times our excess reserves. I'll take a look at that. The change in excess reserves here is 8,000. I know the initial deposit was 10, but we had to set aside 2. So the initial basic change in the system is excuse me, an increase in excess reserves of 8,000. The multiplier, which we calculated as 1 over what leaks out, or 1 over 0.2, is equal to 5. And so the potential change in demand deposits without any leakages and this hypothetical continuation is 40,000. So the point is that the banking system is creating money. It's creating these checking deposits or demand deposits that can be spent. And not too many people understand that when deposits are growing, the banking system is multiplying these and creating money in the system. Okay, let's try this again. This time we should take a few moments to do this, so you could always pause the recording and do it. I'm going to walk you through it here, but we have a deposit of 50,000. Set aside 10%, or 5,000. The remainder, 45,000, is excess reserves. That excess reserves is used to support lending. Make a loan of 45,000, and we would have, if we went through our 3 banks, we'd have this expansion of demand deposits, each round getting smaller and smaller because part of the funds are leaking out into reserves. But the ultimate conclusion of that would be the change in excess reserves times the multiplier. Now we already learned the multiplier is 1 over what leaks out. What's leaking out each time is, in this case, the reserve requirement of 10%. So 1 over 0.1 is 10. So whatever the shock was, it's going to be multiplied by 10. Here, our simple equation, the change in excess reserves times the multiplier equals the change in demand deposits. So change in excess reserves of 45,000, multiplier of 10, change in demand deposits 1,000. Okay, this is quick, but you can review it several times to get the hang of it. And we could look at some scenarios just to understand the mechanics of it. So in this table I have reserve requirement of 20, and we know that that gives us a multiplier of 5. 1 over the reserve requirement, legal reserve requirement, is the multiplier. So I immediately know that I have a multiplier of 5. If I tell you there's a shock, that we have excess reserves and the banking system can use it, it would be the multiplier times the shock, or 5,000. So this should be pretty straightforward. In any kind of problem that we're looking at, if you know what the legal reserve requirement is, you know what the multiplier is, corresponding multiplier, and then any shock would be subject to this multiplier. So let's try this again. Change in excess reserves times the multiplier is change in excess demands. So here, our reserve requirement is 10%, which would make our multiplier 1 over 0.1, or 10. Excess reserves of 1,000, and that would be 10 times 1,000, or 10,000. Well, again, you can see this, that the less you have to set aside, the more that would be left in the multiplier process, so you would have a higher multiplier. If you had to set aside 5%, let's give you a multiplier of 1 over 0.05, or a nickel. So you have 20, a multiplier of 20, 1 over 0.05. Still with the same excess reserves of 1,000 means that total expansion of the bank deposits can be 20,000. Right? So you should be able to go back and forth between these because it's just a simple idea. And let's try it one more time. Here you go. Try to fill some of these in. Reserve requirement of 5%, 1 over 0.05, gives us a multiplier of 20. For a demand deposit of 20,000, and we had to set aside the 5% in required reserves, that'd be 1,000. So we have excess reserves of 19,000, and potential change in demand deposits 380,000. That is change in checkable deposits or spending money, 380,000. Reserve requirement of 10% gives us a multiplier of 10. Demand deposit of 100 would have to then set aside 10% or 10,000, and the remaining 90,000 would be excess reserves. That could be subject to a multiplier of 10. So the change in demand deposits, which is a form of money, could be $900,000. 25%, 1 over 0.25 is 4. If we had a demand deposit of 400,000, we'd have to set aside 25% or 100, which would leave us excess reserves of 300, times a multiplier of 4, which is 1.2 million. Well, we can see the mechanics are in place here, but the key point is that the banking system creates spendable money, that is reserve checking deposits, spending our checking deposit money, and the system can grow because of the lending, that is the credit that's given to people, and the debt that's created. So the lending and spending cycle leads to this growth in demand deposits and has an impact on the economy. So the banking system creates money. Money, as we've seen here, can create lending and spending or economic activity. So money somehow affects economic activity, and we like to connection and a little more detail in the next lecture. Thank you.